All right, so let's jump right into Computer Concepts, Module 3, Computer Hardware, Part 3. So in this portion of the Module 3 lecture, we're going to discuss the following topics: performance of computer hardware, troubleshoot problems with hardware and peripherals. Now, I want to be clear. There are a ton of slides on that. Troubleshooting problems. I'm not going to take the time to go through all of those. I will go ahead and advance through those slides so that you can pause and read those slides. I will cover the common things that I want you to know about troubleshooting problems with computers, steps to maintaining computer hardware, and explain how to restore a device and its associated hardware. So what we're talking about when we talk about restore is we're talking about backing up. If we're not backing up our data, backing up our computer, we're not going to be able to restore it. So more detail on performance of the computer. When we talk about the CPU, which we've already talked about briefly, the central processing unit, one of the things that makes a CPU fast is the clock speed. So it measures the speed at which the processor can execute instructions, okay? Measured in either megahertz, like we used to, or gigahertz, like we do today. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail for you. Now, what you see at the right is different bus speeds, which we'll go over. However, the bus speed and the processor work in cooperation with each other, meaning if we put a high-end processor on a low bus speed, the bus speed ends up being what's called the barrier to the performance of the computer. Now, understand that today, motherboards, where the bus is located on the motherboard, is not going to allow you or give you a slow bus speed for a high-end processor. So they're going to make sure, the manufacturers are going to make sure that they match, if you will. So what does it mean, megahertz? Okay, a 1 megahertz processor, millions of cycles per second, okay, means that, you know, if I'm doing a beat, and let's say that's every second that I'm doing a beat, that means that that is 1 hertz, not 1 megahertz, but 1 hertz per second. Each time that beat happens in a 64-bit processor, it's going to be able to process 64 bits. Now suddenly, if we take that to megahertz, and I'll stop clapping, with megahertz, we're talking about millions of cycles per second. A 1 megahertz processor will process 1,000,000 cycles, 64 bits a time, or 64 million cycles per second. The problem was, as consumers and as our use of computers grew, we needed faster processors, and now that gets up to the gigahertz. What's interesting is today, I'm going to pause while I go find a standard processor so I can show you. So here's a great example of a modern computer, and I'm going to go ahead and make this screen bigger so that I can show you the processor. So what we're looking at here is what's called a Dell XPS 157590. This is a fairly new high-end Dell laptop computer. As you can see, it comes with Windows 10, 64-bit, but what we're focusing on is the processor. This is a 6-core processor, folks, and each core has 12 megabits of cache. We talked about that being its memory, and up to 4.5 gigahertz in speed. So that's what we're talking about. That's 4.5 billion, with a B, processes per second, 64 bits every time it processes. So that's enough about the CPU. The clock speed is important. The cache is important. The more it can store locally without going out to RAM. Then we talk about bus speeds. And bus speeds, okay, determines the speed at which data travels, okay, across the computer to other storage devices. There's a bus speed into, say, the SATA drive. There's a bus speed into memory. Now, of course, the bus speed into RAM is going to be fastest because that's where the CPU is going to store its data. A fast CPU with a slow bus can lead to what's called bottlenecking. I call it a barrier. They're calling it a bottleneck. We want to make sure that we have the fastest bus speed that our CPU can support so that we can utilize that whole thing. And The chart on the right there shows you some standard bus speeds. So ISA, when we had that, you see the bus speed was 8 megahertz. We're now up to 133 megahertz. That's 1 gigabyte per second transfer, okay? So keep that in mind. GB, capital GB for gigabyte versus lowercase gb, gigabits, okay? Which tends to be speed when we talk about speed, okay? So gigabytes, you know, how much data, gigabits, what can be transferred. Finally, benchmark. If we're wondering, or we're going to build our own computer, or we're wondering how one component compares to another, we can go out to benchmark sites and see how things perform. For example, a lot of people see that deal on flash drives and they go out and they buy that flash drive because it was inexpensive and it is very slow. Well, folks, with all technology, we get what we pay for. Okay, so if you're wondering how that device really compares to other devices, what we can do is go out to passmark.com, for example, and we can benchmark a lot of standard computing components to see how they compare to the competition. For example, some people will see when they're buying a computer that it's an i7 processor. But what some of you may not know is there's actually i5 processors. i5 processors that perform faster than some of the low-end i7. So you got to know what you're buying. Buyer beware. You know, computer or device does not power up. So when we talk about troubleshooting, here's where we get started. Here's what I want to say. Basic troubleshooting of a computer. Have you restarted the computer? So many times restarting the computer solves the problem a little bit, or a byte got in the wrong place, stopped the operating system, and a simple reboot will start it. Now, if it continues to lock in the same place, then we can go out to Google and we can say, hey, you know, I'm in my Trend Micro antivirus and I click on this button and it constantly stops. We want to make sure that we can find the answer. Now, before finding the answer, the biggest thing to ask is my software up to date? Is my operating system up to date? Is the software that I'm using up to date? Is there a newer driver? Remember we talked about peripheral drivers or drivers in computers. Is there a newer driver that I need to install? Is my BIOS up to date? These are all things we want to check. Make sure we're running the latest and greatest. You know, battery does not hold a charge. Hey, could be an old battery. It could be that there was a surge that caused the battery to go bad. One of the key indicators for major problems on a computer is what's called the beep code. If we start up a computer and it doesn't boot, but it goes beep, 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 or maybe it goes beep, 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 we can go out to the manufacturer and look at the beep codes. Hopefully that wasn't too annoying. And through the beep code, we can see what's wrong. We can see that maybe it's not recognizing the processor, it's not recognizing the drive, it's not recognizing something that it needs to perform that basic input operating system boot to find where it goes from there. Now, turns on, but the operating system does not run. Again, do we need to restore? Is there a virus? Is there something going on? Did we get ransomware? Okay. Normally with ransomware, though, they're not going to affect the operating system except to encrypt your files, because if you can't get on the computer, you can't see that you need to pay a ransom. Monitor doesn't work. Well, you know, pretty simple. Check the cables. Is it plugged in? Can I restart it? If I restart the computer, see, there it is. Again, restart the computer. Does it fix it? Keyboard and mouse, if it's peripheral, unplug it. If it's Bluetooth, is it connected to the computer? Go out to your Bluetooth settings. Find out if it's still connected to the computer. And of course, if it's Bluetooth, those work on batteries. Have the batteries expired out of the peripheral device if it's wireless? So there you are there. Again, I'm not going to go through all these. You can figure this out. Let me tell you how to troubleshoot a computer. Even as a seasoned professional, if I'm troubleshooting a challenge with a computer and I can't figure it out right away from unplugging, restarting, plugging it back in, checking the drivers, I'm going to do what you can do. You can save yourself hundreds of dollars an hour by simply going out to Google, asking the question, finding the answer multiple times, by the way, because sometimes people put answers out there because they think it's funny to watch you not get the right answer, not fix your computer, or in fact, do further damage to your computer. So find the answer a couple times, see if people have responded, hey, that worked for me. Go to reliable sites. We've already talked about reliable searches of the internet. So make sure you're on a reliable site. And whatever you do today, when you see those things that say, download this driver fix-it software, don't do it. Okay, free software tends to come with other features such as malware and viruses, or it can take a lot of information off of your computer and give it to whoever did that. Go out to your manufacturer of the computer, install their drivers. They're the ones that are tested. Make sure you're on a reputable site for your hardware, for your peripheral, for your computing device. Okay? Here's some additional examples. Again, I told you I wasn't going to go through them. I would encourage you to pause and just read through this so you understand the material. Challenges with optical discs. Pretty simple. Blu-ray discs today. I go to Redbox, I grab a disc, it doesn't seem to work. Oh my gosh, what am I to do? Well, take it out, rub it on my shirt, be very careful, clean any dirt off. I've actually had ones with candy, like, candy stains on the read part of the disc. Clean it with warm water, bing bang boom, stick it back in. I get to watch my movie. Yay. So look at those. Again, pause. Take a look at this in the way of malware. The only thing I want to mention on this screen is ransomware, is viruses, is malware. These things are going to slow your computer because they're going to be sending data out from your computer to some other bot, to some other site, or they're going to take control of your computer. So make sure you have a good antivirus detection software. Make sure you're not clicking and downloading things that you don't thoroughly trust. And remember, today, unfortunately, we get that email from our friend that says, hey, try this new program. We want to go out and confirm with our friend that indeed it's legit. Indeed, they sent it to us before we just click and kill our computer. Physical damages, pretty easy to look at. Computer devices wet or computing devices wet. Here's what I want to say about that. You get a device wet. If it's off, don't turn it on. Pretty simple. If it's on, turn it off immediately. Go ahead and stick it in a bag of rice. It'll pull the moisture out. Okay, I've even seen, for example, I have an attachment that goes in my dryer. I've gotten a keyboard wet. What I do is I blow off as much as I can with canned air. I stick it in the dryer. I don't stick it in the microwave, folks. You've heard that. Don't do that. Stick it in the dryer on a shelf so it's not tumbling around in the dryer. Dry it out. Dry it with a hair dryer. Make sure it's thoroughly dry. I would still wait 24 to 72 hours before I plugged it in again, because one little spanse between two electrical circuits via water, which is conductive, is going to cause issues. Finally, steps to maintaining a computer. Keep it clean, keep it dry. Folks, especially with desktops, make sure you're opening these up and cleaning out the inside. Use canned air. The reason I say canned air is because it doesn't have high pressure. You see this person up here, who hopefully is a professional, using a compressor. Hopefully he's dialed down the pressure on that, because you have a high compressed air and you stick it in there, you will do damage to computer components. But we want to make sure we blow it out. We want to make sure that we don't have any dust that is conductive. For example, when I was the IT director at a company that manufactured carbon components, that carbon dust would get in there. It would span between two circuits and ruin the computer. So we actually had to put computers inside protective cases that were custom built to keep that carbon dust out of the fans in the computer. We definitely want to look at an uninterrupted power supply, or at least a surge protector. That way, if electricity that's connected to suddenly gets a high surge, the surge protector is going to catch that before the computer does. A little surge in a computer can ruin the computer, can ruin the device. Even when I'm plugging in my phone, I'm using it via a surge protector. I'm never plugging it directly into the wall as long as I can help it. Now, finally, folks, the most important part. With viruses, with ransomware, with all the software we use, with all the data we store on our computers, photos of our kids, history of photos now. All the photos are digital. We want to make sure we have a good backup. Now, if I can't compel you via your family photos to back up your computer, I'm certainly not going to compel you to back up your business computer because it has Excel files or Word files or etc. Most people, before they back up, end up having to have a major loss where they lose a bunch of data, and suddenly they realize for about $100 they could be having a reliable backup that backs up their computer on a regular basis. Folks, backup companies are making this really easy. You can now back up your entire computer to the cloud. Now, let's be clear. I'm not talking about just backing up your files and folders. I'm talking about backing up the entire computer. If you want to back up your files and folders, that's called cloud storage because you can access them. Okay, and that to some degree is a backup. But let's realize, unless we have physical control over that data, even a cloud storage provider could go down and lose our data. So we want to have a real backup. I use a product called Acronis. I'm not promoting Acronis. There's other great products. But for $19 a year, I can usually find the Acronis product on sale. And then I can get an external hard drive from Costco and just back up my computer as much as I'd like. My computer automatically backs up on Friday night. I plug it in, it backs up. I take that drive because it sits next to my computer and stick it in my car. That way, if the house burns down, somebody comes in, they steal my computer, they're not also stealing my backup. I can't tell you enough, folks, back up your computer, especially today with ransomware, where your computer can be compromised and encrypted, and the only way to get back your data is to restore the entire device. And if you don't have a backup, you may end up deciding to pay that ransomware company. There are professional companies, there are cities that are paying $50,000 to $100,000 in ransom because someone in the IT department didn't have a good, reliable backup of all their data. Folks, that's it for this part. And that's it for this series. Take care.